Abraham did not just have one son, Abraham had two sons. Now, why does that matter? Well, John Stott points out that one of the Jews' loudest and proudest boasts was that they were descended from Abraham, the father and founder of their race. And they were utterly convinced that their ethnic identity as Abraham's descendants guaranteed them the blessing of Abraham's inheritance. I mean, it says so right in the Bible. You can read it in Genesis 17, where God comes to Abraham and says, I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you, throughout their generations, for an everlasting covenant, to be a God to you and your offspring after you. And I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land of your sojourning, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession. And then here's the real treasure, and I will be their God. I will be their God. And so you talk to any man on the street in Jerusalem of the day, and they would say, well, there it is, black and white. Go look at the scroll. Read what it says. Indisputable proof that Jews are God's favored people, because the Jews are Abraham's descendants. And so their ethnic tie to Abraham was their boast before men and their assurance before the Lord. But it was a false assurance. John the Baptist put his finger on it, and when he came preaching in the wilderness and people were coming out to be baptized, and we read in Matthew chapter 3, when he saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees coming to his baptism, he said to them, you brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come? Bear fruit in keeping with repentance, and do not presume to say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our father. For I tell you, God is able to raise from these stones to raise up children for Abraham. Why does he say, don't presume to say to yourselves? Because that's exactly what they presume to say. Well, we're Abraham's children. That's exactly the conversation Jesus had with the Pharisees in John chapter 8. And he talks about how he's come to set people free. And they say, what are you talking about? We've never been in bondage to anyone. We're Abraham's children. And Jesus says, I know you're Abraham's offspring, but if you were his children, you would do what Abraham does, the work of faith. Paul highlights this vast chasm that exists between these two sons. They have the same father. And yet, everything else about them is profoundly, radically different. So they have different mothers. You can read about it in Genesis chapter 16. Ishmael's mother is Hagar. She is the servant, the slave of Sarah. And Sarah, having despaired of having children, as the practice of the day was, it was thought that you could sort of have children by having your servant go into your husband with your husband and have children that way. And so that's what they did. Genesis 16, and Ishmael is born to Hagar. Isaac is born of Sarah, two different mothers. And Paul points out two different mothers with profoundly different status. So one is born to a slave woman. Ishmael is born to a slave woman, and thus he himself is a slave. And Isaac is born to a free woman, and thus he himself is free. So you see, one is a slave, one is a son. They do not have equal status in the household of Abraham. One, and the difference, you see, is not just that one has to work hard and the other doesn't. The difference is one gets inheritance and the other does not. That's the difference it makes between whether you're a slave or a son. Do you get the inheritance? Well, one did, one didn't. And then Paul presses on, they're born by different power. One was born naturally, according to the flesh. One was born supernaturally, according to the Spirit, according to promise. Ishmael stands for what natural man can do. Isaac stands for what only God can do. And so you see, the critical issue is not, is Abraham your father? The critical question is Sarah your mother? Who is your spiritual mother? Are you a slave or a son? Or is your religion a religion of nature? A religion of laws and doctrines and duties? Or is it a religion of grace and the power of God? A religion of divine intervention and divine promise?